Thank you, everyone. Firstly, thank you for taking time out of your busy lives and your personal schedule to be here today with us on what is the first day of spring. So you'll see, so beautiful, first day of spring. So my name is Pete Atkinson. I'm the Vice President of Sales here at Emergn. I'm fairly new to Emergn, but I'm very familiar with all the good work that we do and the fantastic customers that we've had in the past and we continue to have. So today's the theme of today's event is this: improving the system. So this is actually a follow-up to an event we did in October, which was called "It's Not the People, It's the System." If you didn't see that event, that's not a problem because we're going to do a full recap for you, so it's not a problem. What we're going to be covering today, we're going to be looking at a bunch of things, but including sort of roadblocks, obstacles, complexities, problems, traumas, and importantly, how we go about addressing them. What are the tools and techniques for making that good? To be fair, if we didn't do that second bit, then it would just turn into a whole sort of group therapy session. So I'm really glad we kept that in. So, to help, we have three fantastic panelists. So on my right, we have Andrew Husak. Andrew is our Chief Product Architect. He's also one of the founders of VFQ, which is Emergn's game-changing philosophy on the way of work. He's also the man with the best hair in our consulting practice. But I should say it's a fairly low bar. We also have two fantastic other panelists, two very, very senior executives. I'm delighted they managed to join us today. We have David Zimmer. David is the Chief Product and Strategy Officer at dunnhumby and previously at Teleport. So he has some great stories and fantastic information to share with us today. I'm also delighted we have Manjit Singh. Manjit is also a very, very senior board executive, board member, formerly of Toyota North America. And I'm delighted he actually sits on the Emergn board as well. So, and Manjit was at an Emergn event yesterday in New York. So he's jumped on a plane and travelled here overnight, a bit like Phil Collins did in Live Aid for any of us that are old enough to remember 1985. But anyway, so personally to both of you, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. So today is not just about listening, okay? It's about really engaging. Now, I'm not trying to encourage heckling, but really difficult, challenging questions would be really appreciated. That's what these guys are here for, to help with. So after the event, there'll be some more food, some really good food, and some more wine. But importantly, plenty of time to network. So please make those connections. There are lots of people from Emergn here today. Most of my sales team has made it here today, but it's a free bar, so that wasn't a difficult ask. But I mean, apart from that, just please enjoy it. Get what you can out of it. Talk to us. If you have any questions, ask. I'd love to. I haven't met many of you, so the course of the evening, I'd like to meet all of you. That'd be really good. Okay, that's it. The only other information is the fire exit's that way. The restrooms are that way. I've still got the mic, so I'm going to hand the floor now to Andrew to kick things off. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Pete. Whoopsie. Oh. Not good. Oh, well. Shouldn't have sat down. I can hold it. Right, so as Pete mentioned, we had it previously on the Emergn channel. We talked about systems of work, and we concluded with this lovely picture where we observed that many people and many companies invest in creating fantastic workers, fantastic agile people, fantastic lean people, and then they take them back to the old environment, which hasn't changed at all. And so these people can't apply their skills, and therefore it's usually the system that is the limiting factor. So that's what we concluded with. But there was a derivation of that, and I'm not going to recap the entire talk, but we started the whole journey of observing the fact that people are employing the wrong systems is because we wanted to look at what makes a good system. And we know what those look like, and what we observe in the wild, so to speak, is not it. How do we know? We know because we actually challenged the fundamental principle underpinning these systems of work. and that is something called certainty. When people manage time, cost, and scope. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with those three little words that probably govern your entire life. And we said, well, what if you didn't do that? What if you instead focused on value, flow, and quality? And we came up with 3 guiding principles that define the philosophy of work, which we call VFQ. It should be obvious why we call it VFQ. And we kind of also gave you a big picture without an awful lot of detail. But this is kind of like a horse blanket for you to understand how all the pieces fit together. So we have our guiding principles over here, along with some ideas around how mindset and measures and mechanics work. That leads to a case for change, which you can then do through an improvement or transformation journey. And the end result is a new operating model and the idea that your company, your business is a thriving one, which means that it succeeds now and in the future. Today, we're going to zoom in on some of these pictures, or at least on some of this, because we didn't really tell you, we told you what the problem was, but we didn't kind of tell you how to go and solve it. So we're going to start exploring the idea of how to go about changing. So this brings us to one of the zoom-ins, is on the big picture, this appears at the very bottom, and this is the journey that people who want to improve need to embark on. And this journey is underpinned by challenging some precepts, some ideas that probably have been around your businesses forever. And that is how you structure the work, how you structure the people, and how you structure the thinking. But in reverse. So you actually start with the thinking. If you change your thinking, chances are you're going to realize that changing the way you structure the people, not projects, is possible. And then changing the way that you structure the work, not projects, is also possible. And you start to embark on a journey from project to product, to actually start employing ideas that might look something like this. A lot of our visuals have a contrast of actually the journey of changing from something to something. This is another one of those. And it's meant to be a little emotive, a little bit. You need to feel something. So what we're trying to contrast is the old world, where you first envision perfection, right? Lovely pyramid. We know exactly what it's going to look like. We know exactly the dimensions. We know exactly the materials we're going to build it from. We know exactly the people we're going to do it with. Ace. And then reality kicks in when you actually look at the final product. It's a thing that hardly stands up and holds together. But what you're doing is pushing with certainty. So literally imagine pushing that thing around. There's a lot of friction. It's hard to redirect it. It's hard to push it uphill. It's very easy to go downhill. Actually, it'll go down very quickly. Okay? And this kind of way of thinking and working is actually underpinned by a number of practices. They're actually collections of practices. So traditional work management, project teams, and let's say competent engineering. But the alternative is to roll with uncertainty. The pun is intended, if you spotted the pun at all. But what we're doing is actually, we don't quite know what we're going to end up with, where we're going to be, but we're always going to point somewhere that makes sense now. And we're going to adjust that trajectory based on what we learn. So it's easy to change direction. It's easy to go uphill or downhill or sideways. That's the whole idea of working differently. But that approach requires a completely different system of work. And this is where we end up with these things down here, because there's a progression to changing the system of work. We call it a journey. You can call it something else. But you are likely to be somewhere on the spectrum of that journey. And what we're going to talk about next is those steps as entry point to change and improvement and transformation. So I'm going to challenge you. As we talk about these points, and in a second, both David and Manjit are going to join in with their perspective and some war stories. I'm going to show you these 4 entry points again, and I'd like you to support yours. Right, so as you're listening, try to say, are we there? Are we further along? That kind of thing. Very few people are at the very last step. If you are, I want to talk to you. Okay, but let's start with the first one. So, keeping the driver racetrack analogy going, taking first steps, that's your entry point of first steps. That's when you get on the track. Okay? And you will see these 4 things at the top, the 4 columns, are common to all of the entry points. They're the ways for us to kind of reason about what needs to be changed and what needs to become true. And there are 4 areas, right? Just very quickly, I'm just going to show you that these 3 are exactly the same as these 3. So there's a connection there. And we're adding leadership. So it actually starts with leadership because it's the leaders that need to figure out the fact that they need the other 3. And they need to figure out how they're going to go and put those in place. So you need a change vision. You need to know where you're going. You need to know, for example, we're going to transform. Why? What's the reason? Is it because we are struggling in the market? Is it because we can no longer afford to run? Is it because of competition eating our lunch, right? Whatever the reason is, it needs to be a compelling reason, and you need to have a view of the destination. And with that, you actually need to plan your first steps. It's not a Wild West, let's just go and try stuff. It needs to be deliberate, it needs to be measured, it needs to be checked, it needs to be supervised, because people are learning new things. What are they learning? Well, yes, there are columns, but you need to read those things kind of like that, because every row is a bit of a step. So in the area of product management, if you want to apply leading product management, you need to first change how you understand your customers and your consumers in general, because you can have internal consumers who are not customers. Okay, so you need to learn skills and techniques for understanding your market. Meanwhile, teams need to start to use feedback. If you think about how a project works, there is no feedback. There might be pushback, but there's never feedback, right? You just report. You're not learning anything because you've already made all the decisions up front, right? And so this is a new skill, and people need to learn how to do that. Without it, nothing else is possible in this way of working. So you go sort that out, and then on the engineering side, people need to start thinking architecturally. This is coming from an architect, I confess. But you'd be surprised how many places I've gone into and said, can you show me the architecture of your solutions? A nice big picture of how stuff hangs together? Very few places actually have that picture. Can you imagine going into a town and saying, do you not have a plan of your town? Every town will have a plan of its town, of itself, right? So that's kind of the equivalent, right? I'm going to speed up. What then happens is that product management builds on the idea of understanding your target markets and then figuring out how to shape demand. I was having a conversation earlier with Daniel about de-scoping. What is the smallest, cheapest, fastest thing we can do to deliver value and learn something? And that is a skill. And it is shaping demand for delivery. And then once you do that, you still have the other job of selecting the right things in the right sequence. and that is also a set of skills, right? On the teamwork, you now start working incrementally because the people shaping demand allow you to do that. So you're not doing big batch, big bang things, you're actually creating increments and working that way. And you later refine them iteratively. So the difference between incremental work is you're actually trying to partition the work. And iterative means, okay, now that we've learned something, what can we refine? What do we need to throw away? What do we need to add? What do we need to adjust? Okay? And then finally, on the engineering side, don't start writing and building stuff unless you know how to test it. Ever. Hard, but you cannot do otherwise. And then once you do that, that enables continuous integration, and that will be an order of magnitude improvement in the speed with which engineering can work. So that's my spiel. I'm now going to carry over to David, who can give you an example of what happened in Travelport, not teleport, but that's okay.
Teleport sounds cool.
Teleport is great.
Well, when you talk about entry points, I entered at rock bottom. I think sort of Travelport is probably one of the oldest technology companies in the world because it grew out of airline reservation systems in the 60s. And me and my CTO opposite were essentially handed part of the business that was supposed to be the growth engine of the business, and it was growing at about 2%. And product and technology were fundamentally broken. Think of like the Niagara Falls of waterfall approaches. So we probably had a dozen monolithic developments in flight at any given time that were moving at snail's pace. I think the average time when we did some initial looking, the average time from initiation to writing the first code was about 4 or 5 months. The average length of development was anywhere up to 18 to 19 months. So it was a mess, and this was my first product role as well. I made a lateral move, and we were aware of VFQ as a framework, but I or my colleague had never used it in anger. So when you talk about the leadership piece, literally the first thing we did from day one was we picked up the phone to Alex, and we were with Alex Adamopoulos in a room before I had even met my team, and we were writing, what getting to a product-led strategy would look like. And the second thing we did there is we wrote, literally in real time with Alex helping us, 6 principles that would guide everything we did for the next 4 years. So at any given time, anybody in product and technology, they could look at those principles and say, if I'm not working to those, what the hell am I doing? So we started with that before we even looked at what we were dealing with. And then we got into actually the basic hygiene. And basic hygiene was about kind of bringing Emergn in. Andrew was one of the people that really helped lead both training and coaching. And we did a couple of things. The most impactful things we ended up doing were training in how to write a good story and training in how to break down work into relevant, sort of value-producing increments. And that was a fundamental change. That was a mind-blowing change. But what we also did is we made sure beyond the training, we had started with a few different cohorts, a few different teams. We didn't try and do a big bang change. We said, hey, we're going to take a bunch of teams that we think can get this, and we're going to train them, and we're going to coach them. And the coaching was probably the most important part because you learn about breaking down work, you learn about writing stories, but until you actually are sitting there day to day and trying to put that in practice, having somebody like Andrew to sit there and say, well, have you thought about it this way? Have you thought about it that way? Try that and come back to me, kind of tomorrow, and let's see if it works. So that basic hygiene was critical. And the other thing we did was just we started with Kanban. So thank you to Toyota and Manjit there. We started just basic, again, discipline with Kanban that helped us kind of triage, what we were doing and the work we were doing and how we were getting after it. So I wouldn't underestimate that point about, just getting the basics right got us probably 80% of the way that we needed to get. And then doing the other things beyond that and maturing and really getting proficient at the practice of VFQ, that got us the other 20%, but the basics were huge.
Thank you, David. So we're going to build up a picture, right? So we're going to gray out the first 3 rows. And the next entry point is to get better with every race. So the reason why the race car thing works quite nicely is because you go around in a circle over and over and over, right? So this is, that's what businesses do, right? If you don't believe me, just look at your financial year. It happens every year, right? So bigger steps. You still need a plan. So leadership is still involved. This is not a willy-nilly thing. You need to be strategic and deliberate about it. But this entry point is about basically your fundamentals haven't been taken care of, which, by the way, you can get quite wrong. So it might be some remedial action that you're going to have to take. But you can do that as part of bigger steps. Okay? And the product people are now looking at optimizing value, not just being able to get value out the door, but to actually strategically pick what should be valuable, or at least test what is valuable. Teams in general are now looking at cyclical work. We're talking about generations of products, right? You've heard of things, you know, such and such Mark 1, Mark 2. Right? Look at car models. There are different generations. You've probably driven any kind of make. The car was called the same thing over many, many years, but if you compare it to what it looked like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, they don't look anything alike. Like VW Golf, for example, right? That was around for a very long time. What you drove in the early 80s looked nothing like what you drove in the late 90s, for example. And there was a lot more changes under the hood or bonnet, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're in. So cyclical work is about thinking about generations. In really techie speak, you're all familiar with major and minor releases, right? So cyclical work is about major releases, right? Iterative work is about minor ones. Incremental work is about minor ones. You can almost think of iterative work as patch releases. Okay, anyway, that's kind of the connection. And then engineering wants to get to a point where deployment is no longer a problem. We're working now today, well, not this very moment, but we're working with a company these days where they are unable to deploy stuff. And because it's extremely difficult and hard, everything else is designed to be a big batch because they want to avoid the problem of deploying, right? So it creates other problems. But that's what's happening, okay? So that's what we're trying to do. And now a lot of these ideas around improvement, right? So it's actually taking your basics and getting better at them. You could stay and continue to do this forever and ever, almost. There's a point where the next bit of improvement is not worth the money. But people should be in the mind of improving all the time, looking for things that they could improve and change. And because that idea was employed for decades at Toyota, I'll let Manjit offer you some perspective as to how it used to happen there.
Yeah, so one of the fascinating things about Toyota, everybody should be familiar with the Toyota production system, and David mentioned Kanban, but Gemba walks, there's a whole mentality around continuous improvement. So you would think this would permeate the entire organization. Well, it does in the manufacturing business, but it didn't anywhere else. And so walking into a shop that had been spending 2 years on the agile journey, creating product management roles, realigning engineering to be DevOps, and completely failing. I mean, to the point where every single deployment in a given month would either fail catastrophically or fail within a few days. And when we're talking the type of systems that we had interacting with millions of customers, this was clearly a problem that needed to be solved. And so what we did is we took the Toyota production system and we applied it to software development. So we would do retrospectives and we would force people to go on a Gemba walk. And if a Gemba walk is essentially you go out, you touch, you feel, and to understand the problem. And it is not the engineers who do that. It's the management team that does it. So the management team can get a full understanding of what is the real problem here. because it's not the person on the line, it's not the engineer, it's the system that's not working, and you need to make an intervention. And what is that intervention going to look like? How much is it going to cost? And at what time frame do you want to give for that intervention? So we had to involve management, and that goes back into this leadership principle. You cannot just drop these things on your teams, you have to help them. And you have to be actively engaged. So we figured out a bunch of things on our Gemba walks. First off, simple thing, teams weren't talking to one another. So handoffs were still happening in silos, even though it was agile. It was still just, here, I threw it over the fence. That team should have caught that. It's their problem, it's not my problem. So we did a lot of work realigning teams. The second is we had completely poor tooling. I use the analogy of, if we were on the production line, we would have had one screwdriver, and it would have been of the same type, even though we had 10 different screws. We were doing that in IT. We had no CI/CD pipelining. We were trying to work in the cloud with engineers who had no idea how to leverage the cloud. So we made some immediate interventions, and as we did that, we saw our deployment success rate go up 60%. And we did that in the space of a couple of months, just by making these key changes. And again, the beauty of it was, we talked to the engineering teams and said, this is the Toyota manufacturing process. This isn't like something new to the world that we just came up with, some sort of black magic. This is exactly what the rest of the organization does, what we as a company are known for, and we're now taking this discipline and bringing it into our software development teams.
Thank you. So, Manjit just mentioned teams. These are the kinds of things you can do with individual teams, onesie, twosie. We're now talking about the next steps is actually expanding to networks of teams. And the first thing you're going to do is synchronize everyone. Why? Because bigger things are hardly ever done by single teams. You can have multiple teams involved, and there's going to be dependencies, that dreaded word. I can't do my stuff until they're done, right? And those people need my stuff. So this is about synchronizing everybody. It's your kind of first step around networks of teams. Again, you need to do this deliberately, because particularly if you're trying to scale, you can't change everything at once. You just say, right, we're going to connect these people, this cluster over here first, then we're going to move to these. That's what we mean by a connected demand plan, where you're taking advantage of the natural connections connected to a product or service, okay, instead of sort of big swathes across your entire portfolio, okay? But what's happening at that point is that the product manager folks can start to optimize the portfolio. What that means is that they get rid of some stuff, okay? And they add some stuff as well, okay? So this is about getting the best throughput of value. And then the teams themselves become a network. So it's actually not individual demand coming in. It's a demand that needs to propagate across a network, and you understand what that network looks like. Again, the simple view of that is just dependencies. Understand the dependencies. Not just between the teams, but also between the products and their components. And then on the engineering side, you need to kind of graduate to being able to do continuous delivery. Because the delay of not being able to do that is too big a price to pay, actually. So by continuous delivery, it means now that if I want to go and introduce a feature, because there is an opportunity in the market and the product people are saying that's the optimal thing for us to do, okay? The teams say, okay, we now understand who needs to be involved, and you can push it out without waiting for a 2-week sprint, a 3-week sprint, a 2-month planning thing, whatever, right? You can literally push it out within days, and in some cases, hours. Okay? So that's what this is about. And again, some insight from David.
Yeah, so this is, as we said, we started with, a small number of cohorts trying to work differently. We got the basics right there. And what we saw was all the teams that weren't working that way started to come to my CTO and I and say, we want to do what they're doing. That looks better, and also it looks a lot more fun. And so at that point, we realized, okay, we're generating the mass. We need to think a little bit differently about how we organize and how we structure. So we did a couple of things. We had to reorganize teams. We had dozens of people who are all doing slightly different things, slightly different ways. So we had product analysts, we had business analysts, we had technical product managers, and I forget there's a couple other names in there. But we essentially created product owners as essentially the fulcrum of this entire process. And we said, sort of, right, we're going to move you into technology first because that's where you're going to learn. And then they worked in technology for a bit, and then we brought them back into product because we said, well, now that you've learned, that's actually where you're going to have the most impact. That's where we're going to be able to exploit you. So we did some reorganization of teams. We also did a whole lot of work around the demand network, as Andrew talked about. Everything that our teams built was dependent on being deployed into a point of sale that was owned in another part of the business. So we actually did a lot of work with that team in Spain. They were in a completely different geography, reported into a completely different part of the business, but we had to bring them into the VFQ mindset because we were getting to the point where our teams were working and it was hurry up and wait, because we were now trying to deploy in a completely different approach that was used on the point of sale. So there was a lot of work to really build out the value chain across the business. And the last thing we did, very simple, we did sort of these post-education checkups, where as teams came on board, we had Emergn people able to come back in and not so much the retrospective or the gimbal walk kind of approach, but we looked at when we were now sort of certifying teams as VFQ capable. We did these post-education checkups to say, okay, what are the new, after we've removed a layer of complexity, what are the new barriers that are surfacing? What are the things now that we're hearing that people could then share and that diagnose some of the new issues and nuances, so that whole idea of kind of touching and feeling what's happening, that became a big part of our process. And really that's where we got into the continuous improvement.
Perfect, thank you. Right, last entry point. Now, we're trying to not just synchronize, harmonize. So again, we need a plan how we're going to do this, because it's if you try to harmonize things that don't have anything to do with each other, why? And people try to do that as well, right? So not everything needs to be harmonized. So you need to understand what should be harmonized. But this is now not just about portfolio optimization. This is about business optimization. This is actually trying to improve the performance of your entire business as a collective performance of your products and services. And then the team working, we've been doing improvement all along, getting better and more capable of doing stuff. And now what you want is an embedded culture, self-motivated culture of improvement, where people just have a habit of looking for ways of improving and being able to do it. So as leaders, you need to allow them to do that. And then the cryptic thing here on the engineering side is a nod to a colleague of mine called Fred Hackstrom, who is our CTO at Emergn. DOME stands for DevOps Model for Enterprises. So it's a little better than just DevOpsy things, onesie, twosie systems. This is trying to do DevOps at enterprise level. And we have a model for that. We have lots of models. But we also have the practical experience and advice behind it. And now, actually, I'll let both gentlemen contribute to some comments around that. So, Manjit.
Yeah, I'll start off. First off, I wish I had the DOME concept when I was at Toyota. We needed that desperately. A lot of the planning exercises that large enterprises go through are not agile. They're typical waterfall. You go through an annual planning process, you go through a quarterly update of that planning process, and then maybe you take it down to a monthly process. The challenge is, how do you interconnect the work that you are doing from a software development perspective to the products and services that the business is actually delivering? And so if you think about a company that is delivering connected vehicles and capabilities around connected vehicles, you have to be pretty darn disciplined around your process of what you're going to be delivering, making sure it works, of course, and then be in lockstep with the business as to how are you going to potentially monetize that. And so this led us to completely rethink our planning processes. And we actually did, yes, we did the macro budgeting annual exercise. We kind of have to do that as a publicly traded company. But we had the business teams and the development teams working together on a weekly, if not a monthly basis, to be in sync on what was going to be delivered during that time period. Enough to allow sales and marketing to ramp up on any product or services, or ramp down if we knew that we were going to be delayed delivering something. And again, the communication here had to go through all of our dealers in all of North America and parts of Latin America as well, because we were supporting them. So it might seem simple on the surface. You just call somebody up and you say, oh, yeah, sorry, we're not going to deliver this month. It's going to be next month. Can you just readjust the plan? Sure, I'll go notify thousands of people, pull in all of that collateral, update it as necessary. That wasn't going to work. So by forming the teams and bringing the business in, we did two important things. First, the development team suddenly understood some of the business concepts about why we were actually delivering this. The product owners absolutely did, but the core engineers usually didn't. We brought them in, so now the engineer actually understood why we're developing this feature and what the value is out in the marketplace. So that was one big thing. The second is the business kept on looking at us and saying, like, why can you just not deliver to the timeline that you had given us? Well, now let me pull you into the process, and you can begin to understand it's not something that we're doing intentionally. It's not that we don't have the right level of talent. They're just problems that we're trying to solve along the way in this new methodology, while before we would have baked in a lot of padding time, and it would have been an 18-month, 24-month process. So which one of these two things would you like? By the way, in the 18 and 24-month process, you would not have been included in the conversation. Today you are. So you have influence. You have more influence than you ever had before. And suddenly, as teams were getting more and more used to this way of working, and you started seeing the positive impact, as David said in one of his experiences, everybody wanted to jump on. Can I please be a part of that team that is working in this collaborative and agile fashion? We don't want to do it the old way. I knew that we had success when the CFO came to me and said, we're going to do a major SAP implementation project, and I want it to be done in an agile, with using agile methodologies, and I want all of the teams to be working together, business and IT. That's when you knew you had the breakthrough, because they were putting up the money, and they were putting up the money and putting up the resources, and they were willing to invest behind this because they knew it was successful.
Yeah, and on my side, I think interconnectivity is the right word, and some very similar themes. We took the VFQ work that we had done, sort of over months and months and months with our product and engineering teams. We created a 3-day mini VFQ, kind of intro course, and we actually got all of our salespeople, anybody who is in sales or business development. We got all of our finance people, and I forget who else. We got them all together, and for 3 days they did nothing but understand what VFQ meant and what we were trying to do in product and technology. So at the end of it, we actually had salespeople going, oh, now I understand why you can't give me a delivery date for product X 12 months ahead of time. And so, that was kind of one of those breakthrough moments where they say, I get it. The other thing that we did was we brought all of the teams together in Amsterdam for a big, essentially almost an all organization meeting. and we talked about the impact that the VFQ work was having, and sort of a similar light bulb went on for a lot of people, and we were able to really push changes through in the annual planning. So when we had everybody together, we didn't have the usual, we're going to argue over this line item, you know, 10,000 pounds worth of work in a $30 million budget. We got together and we talked about funding teams and themes. And that was a great bit of work because we had, you know, sort of the salespeople, product people, engineers, talking about the themes that we were going to focus on. And then we could go away and say, well, we'll figure out which teams we applied to that. So the transition for Travelport to funding teams and themes rather than, you know, sort of the painful planning process was a huge piece. And it meant that, you know, over the course of the 3 years that we were really working on the transformation, we went from a budget of $5 million when I joined to a budget of almost $30 million. So, you know, trust in the business that if they gave us a few more dollars, we could do something with it. And we went from driving revenue growth of 2% when we started to, in 3 years, we were at 10 to 12%. So, you know, we could see the actual tangible impact of getting everybody on board. It's not just about product and engineering are working a little differently. It's we are all working differently.
Thank you, David. And I must say, I was in Amsterdam with these guys, and the change that I saw over that period of time was phenomenal. But it was fun. We passed balls around as well. Now, I want to emphasize one thing very quickly on this slide. How many of you have used KPIs or are using KPIs in your businesses now? Okay. How many KPIs do you have? Give me a range. More than 10? How many? Right? More than 50? Higher? Higher? Okay. Right. Here's the difference between, here's what harmonize means. It means 2 or 3 KPIs for everybody at a time. Just let that sink in. Not tens, not hundreds, not a hierarchy of KPIs. No. 2 or 3 for everybody. Right. Meanwhile, while all that's happening, you've heard some stories. This thing that we kind of unveiled to you last time, which we call the VFQ adoption model, is there all along to help you. So there's more detail behind the scenes for this one, but this really drives change. It allows people to focus on things that are different and actually make more sense to them. So don't let the system be your limiting factor, please. Talk to some experts. Let us help you. But above all, don't let the experts tell you what to do. Listen, learn, but own what you change. It's your company, it's your people, it's your products, it's your market. You need to own your own transformation. So, we probably went a little longer than anticipated, but did you spot your entry point? There is no right answer, right? And I guess, based on what you just heard, are there things that you have questions about, that puzzle you, where you don't quite know what you might need to do or should do next? Anybody want to ask? Obviously, these are not the only questions. You can ask whatever you like. Sorry? Alcohol? Yeah, bring out the alcohol. Yeah. Yes.
Hi there. Thank you very much for sharing those insights. They're actually, it's brilliant. It's really brilliant to hear that. What I was wondering is about involvement of suppliers or third parties who are correlated to your VFQ as well, because we're talking about the system. The value creation model that you're aspiring and that you're pushing, you can go as fast as you're, basically, if you're playing Lego, you need the pieces, right? So how can you get that and all the suppliers on the same quality standard, talking about Toyota, taking my hat off because that's impressive. How was the learning of the sentence?
It was hard for us. Toyota's heavily outsourced across the entire business, and software development was no different. So we actually had to choose, we ended up choosing 2 big partners, and we brought them into this entire process. So unfortunately, we did not use VFQ, big mistake. We should have. But we had to go through some intensive training with them and essentially do what everybody says you should be doing, which is you should be acting as one team. They are an extension of your team. They are no different than your team. That was very hard to do because we were also geographically distributed, just like sounds like Travelport was. It was not easy. And we took the approach that if teams weren't working together, we had no issues breaking them apart quickly. So we absolutely followed this methodology of fail fast and rebuild. Fail, rebuild, fail, rebuild. And we had to do that more often because we had these third-party resources who were not motivated in the same way we were. Come a contract renewal time, we changed that. And we actually built into the contract the fact that we were not just doing a labor arbitrage contract, we were actually doing a capability contract. And based upon the outcomes is what they were going to get paid for. And that really started then making a big change because suddenly they were aligned with the biggest incentive possible, revenue, payment, which forced them to actually start adopting the methodologies that we were using.
I think on our side, the simple answer was we were such a mess that we didn't really have the ability to leverage offshore partners or third parties. Pretty much when I started, we were doing everything ourselves because the processes and the approach were so heavily ingrained and kind of specific to the business that we couldn't make use out of it. And it was sort of 2.5 years on in this transformation that we were actually in a position we ended up working with Tata in Gurgaon, that we could actually contemplate doing some offshore working. And we did the same thing though. It wasn't just sort of give me a rate. It was sort of you're going to deliver capabilities, because we had gotten to the point where all the teams were working in more of an agile way that we could say sort of, hey, the India team is going to do this, and the US team is going to do that, and the other teams. So we were able to do that, that interconnected approach. But we couldn't take advantage of it because we hadn't even gotten the basics right.
On a more theoretical basis, Alex, if you are at first steps and the people you're trying to work with ain't going to work. You need to bring them up to the same level, same part of the journey. They could be ahead of you, that could work, but not behind you. Yeah?
And that was our problem. Most of the people were ahead of us.
Exactly.
Learning about KPIs, how did you measure that?
How did we
Measure that maturity? Like, what's maturity?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple things. I said the gut feel. Never underestimate gut feel. The fact that people were saying we want to work like that. So sort of we had just some simple metrics about the number of people that had been trained and had done like the VFQ qualification. That was a big indicator of how well teams would work. We looked at just velocity. Sort of velocity from when I started to when I finished was completely different. And then the other thing is we had a metric around value, because we didn't have a standard way to say sort of how do we measure value. If you say you're going to break something down to the smallest increment of value, well, how are you measuring it? And we used weighted average cost of delay, which had loads of assumptions in it, but it meant that we could balance, we could look at things sort of objectively because everything had assumptions in it. So think about value as a metric as well.
Back then, we couldn't actually advise Travelport with the measures we could advise you now today. So there's ways of measuring it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Liz. I work at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Thank you. That was really interesting. You may or may not appreciate how different the context is where I work. And I am really interested in system change, and I fully accept the need for system change. But my work is part of a massive system, and I'm interested in your reflections on changing the system from within it. So I may make some small changes within my department, which is digital products and services, but I am part of a wider system that decides how money is spent, and I'm interested in how you think that sort of level of system change can be influenced.
So,
The big thing for us was find your pioneers, and give them permission to kind of change the rule book. Sort of from day one, we said to our pioneer teams, you no longer have to do a business requirements document. Even though the finance team said we needed business requirements documents because it provided the audit trail. I was like, well, how many times do the auditors actually look at sort of a 200-page BRD? I know it's probably different in a public sector business, but sort of find your small number of pioneers and empower them to not only change within their system, empower them to go and knock on other doors and be public in that, because the minute that other people know that from the boss on down, he said, hey, David's going to come and ask you for something, you do it. Watch things change quickly. It's just that top-down permission is really important too.
Can I just follow up very quickly? So actually, interestingly, where David was working at Travelport was kind of a carved out part of Travelport as a whole, which made the difference as well. But an absolute point is that you got to give people the permission to change, to follow different rules. Otherwise, nothing changes. So if the outside constraints remain, you're going to end up with Formula One driver, horse and cart, no cups.
It was a wonderful question, and I think we all feel your pain. We really do. I guess, Andrew, the very first quadrant in your columns that were not columns but rows was the change vision.
Yes.
David, you talked about point at something that you can recognise when you're looking for the future. Manjit, you talked about doing the gimbal walk. I guess for me, what I'm looking at is that change vision isn't just the start point. You always come back to it. Yeah. You can't just say, this is where we are and this is where we're going. You constantly have to course correct, because when you do the gimbal walk, Manjit, presumably you discover things that aren't working. It's like that classic TV show, Back to the Floor, right? You have to go back to that change vision and course correct. So, Andrew, from your perspective, when you are implementing these things within organizations, how much do you come back to, guys, is this still the vision that we want to adopt?
All the time. All the time. And the reason is that change itself is a product. And actually, when you think about the organization, so, I talked to you about incremental, iterative, and cyclical development and working. Well, how do you restructure an organization? How do you rebuild it? Incrementally, iteratively, and cyclically. So you treat the organization, and now you say, what's the next version of ourselves? Is it going to be an increment, or is it going to be an iteration? Is it going to be the next generation of ourselves? That's how you manage it. And there, your vision can change, just like with the product. As a product person, you say, we think this is the offering, this is a service, this is a product, based on what we know today. 2 years from now, you say, oh, it's worked for us, but now the world is different, and it will no longer work for us if we continue on that path. Let's take that ball and point it in a different direction and go there. Let's roll with the uncertainty.
And one piece, oh, sorry. Go ahead. I was just one quick piece of advice there. Never call, if this is a digital transformation or whatever, never call it a program. Because what you find in programs is you spend 6 months planning the program, you spend 6 months doing the program, and then you spend 6 months figuring out what didn't work in the program. And so you have to get people out of the mindset that any of this is going to be programmed. It's just business as usual, and we're figuring out it as you go. So if somebody talks about it's a change program, shout them out of the room.
And I was just going to say something very similar. It's like this is where leadership comes in, right? Many times we've heard business leaders declare some big vision, and you say, by a date we'll get there, we'll have this kind of revenue, we'll have these kinds of products out. And the biggest mistake I've seen people make with transformations is they make a transformation a program. It's like, we're going to go undertake a transformation. It's going to take us 3 years, and here's what we're going to do, and here's what we're going to achieve. I hate that. I stand up in front of my teams and I say, we're going to undergo a transformation. Here's what we're looking to achieve. Here's how we're going to achieve it. And we will never stop, because a good transformation, a successful transformation, is an ongoing process. We are transforming the way we're thinking, including the fact that transformation is no longer a thing. It is just continuous change. So with that, you should expect that what's up here on the slide is not going to be the same in 6 months, in 12 months, in 18 months, because we are going to continually improve and change as we learn things. And oh, by the way, our external environment, AKA our customers and our products, are going to be changing as well. And if we don't adapt to that, guess what? You'll have a new executive standing in front of you saying, we need to make a change, and it's going to be in 3 years. So setting that expectation really helps empower the teams, because now the teams are like, oh, okay, so that when you tell me something is going to change, that's kind of the expectation. It's not an event that everybody needs to go talk about, number one. And number two, it goes back to teaching the principles of VFQ, teaching employees how to go through the change curve and recognize that there are emotional states you go through when you go through change. I want you as an employee to throw that out, because every day you're going to go through change. So don't go through the change cycles. Just accept change as that is the daily norm. And when you start actually, seeing the teams take that on, and you as a leader are encouraging it, you begin to see them gel much faster, and the resistance starts breaking down slowly. So one of the things, just quickly, that I also do is I celebrate failure, because failure is a part of change. We learn more from our failures than we learn from our successes, but the only thing we ever talk about is our successes. I had teams that I would encourage to look at what they were doing, look at their product, and say, this isn't working, and maybe we just need to kill it. Teams look at me and like, yeah, that's easy to say, but my next performance review, that's going to be a negative. I'm like, no, I promise you that's not going to happen. And in fact, I will celebrate if you as a team collectively make a decision to go kill something. I will bring you and drag you at the front of the stage, and I will give you an award. And I would do that. Usually it was an award for courage, as you can understand.
So just to emphasize, right? You're going to say, we're going to try this up. It blew up. Oh, cool. What can we learn? Right? Within reason, obviously. You can't be reckless. All right. Anyone else? No? They're just hungry or thirsty or something. Right. Thank you very much. We do this, and thank you.